What's up, guys? This is Richard from A Man About Style, and today we are at The Works, and they are our video sponsor. We're going to be learning visible mending, so if you've ever had holes in any of your clothes, or if you just want to know how to sew cool patches, stay tuned.
Let's see what else. My name is Erin Eggenburg. I own Redbird Arts. It's a mending and embroidery shop. I started it in 2012 as a hand embroidered hinky business. So let's see here. This is what we're going to make today. I'm going to pass around these little patches. You'll notice on your patch you have some lines. And those lines, what we're doing is we're lining up those stitches. We're going row by row, and we're going to line up our stitches and learn this technique. So if you notice all of those little stars, they are lined up on the same row. So that's kind of what we're attempting to do today, and we'll see how it turns out. First, tell you what this technique does. So this is my example. I already have these, but also this. What we're doing today, this is just a patch. And so typically when you're working this type of technique, you're going to patch and stitch all at the same time. But because the technique's a little bit tricky, we're just going to do one, we're just going to practice the stitching today. When you patch, you can put your patch underneath, on the underside of the jeans, or shirt, or whatever it is you're repairing, or on top. And this, I mean, you don't have to cut it in a circle, that's just for style purposes, but on top or underneath, it's the same type of mend, it's just a different location. Your stitches are going to be the same, your materials are the same, it's just a different location. Next, thread. I like to use cotton thread. I may use Sashiko thread. You can also use pearl cotton or crochet cotton. Sashiko thread, pearl cotton, and crochet cotton, they're all cotton threads. Pearl cotton, it has a little bit more of a sheen on it because it's been mercerized, so it has a strengthening process that it's gone through. The thread that we have today here, so you have yarn and you have thread. These are little bits of crochet cotton. Crochet cotton and Sashiko thread are going to be very similar. Sashiko thread is just a little bit softer and woollier than the crochet cotton. Crochet cotton is also really easy to find secondhand. So if you're into like repairing with secondhand materials, this is a good option. You can also use embroidery thread in a pinch. The only reason why I really don't like to use it is because embroidery thread is stranded. And what this is beeswax. And I use this to coat the thread as I stitch. It coats the thread and makes it a lot easier to move through the fabric than without. Not something you have to use, but it's kind of a nice tool to have if you're stitching through a few layers of fabric. Okay, so now let's talk about technique and kind of get started on our stitching. So first, let's go ahead and grab your thread, not your yarn, grab some of the thread. If you want to grab a different color, if that's not your color, then go ahead and swap out. That's what these are on the table. And I'm going to use 4 different colors because we have 4 different directions. And let me talk about directions for a minute, speaking of which. So on your card, there's a little graphic here with the stars on the mending side. And this type of mending, kind of the important thing that you want to do is you're starting on one side of the area that you're patching and you're ending on the other side. You're not stitching around within the patch because then it's really hard for that patch to stay flat. When you start stitching, let's say that these are my 2 layers. When you start your stitching on one side and you end on the other, then as you stitch, those 2 layers come together really, really well. And you're not going to develop any wrinkles underneath, which you definitely feel if you were wearing it later. So flat is really key here. And doing that, this is one of the things that I borrow from Sashiko. A lot of the style, my style of mending, it's embroidery style, and I typically follow the same directionals, although not all patterns have all 4 directionals. So here's what I mean. I would start here. You can start on either side really, but I typically start going with all of my vertical stitches. So here, I would start on this row, and I would go down the row, making each of these individual stitches, okay? And then I would work back up the next row, down the next row, up the next row, and so on until I reach the other side. And then that's my first layer of stitches here. Next, I would come back where these green stitches are, my horizontal stitches. And I'll start either at the top or at the bottom, stitching all of those horizontals, going row by row back and forth until I reach the other side. Same thing for diagonals. We have two sets of diagonals. We have this set, and then we have the set that goes the other direction. So I've got a dark pink and I've got an orange here. So one direction, they all go this way. And we can't go from top to bottom or side to side, but we can go using our diagonal directions. So we'll start in one corner and end in the other. So here is a diagonal, and we go through each of the rows on a diagonal until we reach the opposite corner. And when you do this, you don't have to think about where your next stitch is going to go if you're working in a pattern, because it's already laid out for you. And you get a kind of a cool pattern on the underside as well. Grab some thread and kind of like an arm's length of thread is good. Just so it's manageable enough. If it feels too long, you can always cut off some of that length later. And then grab your wax, the thread over the top of the wax, just like this. And then pull your wax through. If your hands are really cold, you may want to sit on your wax or hold it in your hand for a minute just to heat it up. It won't turn into liquid, but it will just soften just a little bit. And you'll pull it through a few times and you'll notice that it starts squeaking a little bit. There it is. And that means it's coated. And then you can just kind of rub your fingers along the thread to distribute that. Thread your needle. And then we're not going to bring our ends together. We're just using one length of thread. So you'll just make a knot on one end of the thread, and then your other end will be free. From the back to the front, in that lower corner, on the first row. So if you're right-handed, it's going to be your last row, and if you're left-handed, it'll be your first row. And pull that needle all the way through. You should have your knot on the back. Make sure it's not too snug. For making a patch, it doesn't matter because this patch is, all the stitches are going to be just on top. But here's another, I'm gonna keep throwing some little instructions at you as we go. So when you're stitching here, if you think about jeans, there's a little bit of stretch to every pair of jeans, especially if they have stretch built into them. But there's no stretch in your thread, right? So we have to make that work somehow. And making that work is by every row that we stitch. So these were all horizontals here. There are no other directionals. But every row that I stitched, so I did all of my little blue stitches here, and then blue to the next row. And between the two rows, I left just a little bit of slack. And when you leave that slack, the patch will adjust as you wear your jeans. So that little bit of slack, you're not going to see it forever, but the threads will adjust within, and then it gives the jeans the ability to stretch even though there's no stretch within the thread. I don't know exactly how it happens. It's a little bit magic, but if you don't leave that slack in, the first time you bend your knee, that thread is going to snap. So slack is important. Now, not holding the needle too tight, but what we're doing is we're dipping our needle in, and this starts the size of your first stitch. Now, as far as stitch size goes, if you're working with Sashiko, there's a stitch size that you use. I don't think that there should be a stitch size because it depends on how many layers you're working with or how thick are the layers. That's really going to determine the stitch size that you're using. So you're just using one layer of denim right now, not too bad. So you can kind of pick your own stitch size. I would say go between 1/4 and 1/3 of an inch. My stitches are typically farther apart. That's just sort of my style. And the more you practice, the more you'll kind of develop your own style. Okay, so we're dipping this needle in, and then what we're doing is we're using our non-dominant hand to fold the fabric onto the front of the needle. We're never jamming our needle through. We are folding the fabric over the front of the needle like this. So I will dip my needle in, and then using my non-dominant hand, I'm going to fold the fabric over, and I'll walk around and do this a few times. And if your stitches are evenly spaced, all of these little folds will be the same size. On the top, here's a little trick. So I typically end with my needle on the top just because it's a lot easier to start your next row when you have your hand inside a pair of jeans. So what I'll do is I will make that last stitch, and I'll kind of make this, I'll stitch just, oops, that should be straight. I'll stitch just to the side of my first row, and that starts me out so that I'm even with my last stitch of the first row. My first stitch of the next row will be even with it, since we're trying to work all of our stitches. So look at this patch again with these pink stitches up those vertical stitches. Notice how they sit side by side. So each stitch lines up for each row. So that's what we're trying to do, is line up each stitch in each row that we're making. And if you don't, that's okay. You'll learn from that too. Okay, so now, second row. And if a knot forms, don't pull your thread. That'll tighten the knot. Because most knots that form are not real knots. They can be pulled out. But if you tighten it, then you may have to cut your losses. Okay, so I'm at the top of my second row, which is where the bottom of my first row is, right? Everyone at the same spot? Okay, now flip your patch over and see that stitch between your first and second row? That is where the slack gets built in. Once you start your next row here, then you'll have this little stitch right there.
Gotcha.
And then here, so it's a little hard to see here because we have so many stitches over it, but if, let's say, now that we have one full row, let's say your first row is really tight like this, see how it's puckered? And if you're working on something that's a lot larger, to loosen each of those stitches is kind of a pain. So what you can do here, if you have one really tight row, before you tie anything off, is you can loosen it here, and then you can just loosen that entire row by pulling at the top of the thread. So you don't have to loosen every single stitch to get that tension just right. And tension, I promise, is the most important thing. If your stitches are too tight, your garment won't be wearable again. And if they're too loose, then those little stitches are gonna get caught on every single thing that you walk by. It'll catch a nail on the wall, whatever, something. Okay, second row, we will dip our needle back in. And if you ended with your, okay, you did end with your needle on the top. So what you can do is work your needle, just make another stitch back in at the end of this row, and then over to your second row. And make sure you turn your patch as you go. So this row, I went down this way, and so now I'll turn it so that I'm stitching out in front of me for the next row.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you would want to leave a loose thing there if you were covered and you needed to loosen it. But if that doesn't seem to be the case, how much do you leave there for other
Just like, just a little,
Okay.
what can I compare that to? Just like a little half smile, kind of. Like not a full U, but like a really shallow U.
Okay. So not like flat against the back. But like
Yeah, not flat, just a little bit of slack so that you can like flick it with your finger. You can't get your whole finger under there, but you've got enough that those stitches can loosen, or that thread can loosen itself. Now for this second row, here I am at the bottom. And again, just dipping my needle in, and then you can line your stitches up now. So as I dip in my needle, I'm dipping it in right next to where that first stitch was, right? So you're mimicking that space of the first stitch, and then your second stitch, and so on. So now you're stitching less blindly because you're lining up the stitches with those that you previously made. When you knot off, you've got some options here. Diagonal rows go in diagonal rows. So one row here, our next row, so if I go here, the next row will start here. And then my third row is up here.
Okay.
So those are diagonal rows. See that? Let's say I try to start in this other corner. It doesn't work because if I stitch from here to here, my next stitch, it points me up the middle of the square rather than going one row, row, row. So you can't start on one corner, you have to start on the other. Either this corner or this corner for this directional. For this directional, this way of the X, you can only start in this corner or this corner, just because that's the way that the directions are pointing. So in other words, lay your needle across this direction of the stitch that you're going to make. See what direction that's making, that one side of the X? So that's the only direction you'll be making for that entire layer of diagonals. Your second layer of diagonals will only be stitches that go the other way or the other direction of the X. So you're never flipping the way that your stitch is laying. It's always going to be laying in that way, like like a front slash.
Okay, so as you can see, I didn't quite nail it. But either way, I still had a lot of fun learning Sashiko stitching from the works. I definitely encourage you to do some more research for anyone who enjoys sewing or just wants to learn more ways to repair clothes without a tailor. Thanks again to the Work Seattle. Make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support the work, hit us up on Venmo. Until next time, we'll catch you in the next